Welcome to the Personal Development Mastery Podcast. Stand out, don't fit in. Today I have the pleasure and the privilege of speaking with Rob Scott. Rob, you are a master level mindset coach. You have been running your personal development business for over a decade now and have helped thousands of people shift their identity and dramatically break through their limitations. You have taught for companies like MindValley. Your mission is to end suffering on planet Earth, and you teach the powerful and profound mindsets that people need to achieve success, happiness, and fulfillment. Rob, welcome to the show. I'm delighted and honored that you are here today.
Ajay, I'm also honored. This is great. Thank you for letting me be here with you.
My pleasure. Rob, I wanted to start with some elements of your story, which obviously is definitely sparks conversation, interest. It's a truly fascinating story. So I want to start by asking you to take us back and paint the picture of some of the background that actually led you to where you are today.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, let's assume for a second that I'm actually okay at what I do, right? Like if I have any level of really being able to help people today, some people make an assumption about that maybe I always had it together, or I always, came from some life that was, really together. And it's actually very much the opposite. I came from maybe as close to the maximum of dysfunction that you can have without dying. Maybe, I had a lot of people around me that actually died, and where that sort of began for me was at a very young age. I went through a lot of really deep and very ugly abuse and dysfunction. Not to overshare, but I was sexually abused. I was actually raped for years by someone that was a babysitter that my parents would leave me with for periods of time. And that went on from maybe the age of around 3 to around 8 or 9. And I ended up getting, I never felt safe. I never felt, loved. I didn't get the normal emotional development that a child you would hope would get. Right. And so through that, I started to use drugs and alcohol at an obscenely early age. So think about a 7-year-old starting to play with pretty heavy drugs. I started to use alcohol consistently. By the time I was into my teens and my early 20s, I was deeply addicted to very heavy drugs, and just, partying is not really the word, but just, really was a drug addict and an alcoholic very, very early. And so I ended up having that be, into jails and institutions and rehabs and halfway houses and, all the institutions that you can end up in. I had the fun experience of going in and out of, and all the different ways. And then, I ended up homeless. I was just living in my car and then living without a car for a long time. And so along the way, my business is now called Fundamental Shift. I had this really honestly, it was a self-transcendent experience of really deep transformation. And I was actually working on that. I mean, I was in a deep self-inquiry of, what are we doing here? What's the point of this? I had really bad personal lenses and ideas about the world that were, really holding me back in profound ways. And in some ways, those became obvious to me in a moment, in sort of a breakthrough. And so what I discovered way back when was, if I were to put even some of those down, I started to have much higher function in the world, right? If I could put down this lens of I'm a victim and actually just come at the world with a blank slate, I was able to really perform differently. And so I actually went from homeless to vice president of technology without any career degrees or any certifications of any kind, but just by performing well in just a handful of years. To go further in the story, though, even during that, ascent of success, whatever that might be, I got really sick with cancer as well. So by the end of this, I'm through cancer. Luckily, I survived that. But I end up at the end of that, and I'm I know what it is to be deeply dysfunctional emotionally. I know what it is to be deeply dysfunctional physically. I know what it is to be deeply dysfunctional mentally. And I've made some significant changes in that. And so in around 2005, right when podcasts started to come out, I started to share some of these ideas, like how do we consciously evolve, how do we change ourselves, what is hypnosis, what is meditation, what are these tools to gain some self mastery, and what is it to do personal development literally on yourself. And I was shocked, but there weren't too many people listening to podcasts back then, but the people that were, many of them were listening to me. And a lot of them, literally all over the world, started asking me for coaching. It was, what's it cost to work with you? I'd love to talk to you. How do we, do this? And so through that, I started to test out doing some coaching. And what I realized was that was almost the thing that I had always been good at, that even in the deep dysfunction of being a child, I was always trying to help people see things differently. And, there was some innate skill or ability or strategy, maybe a survival strategy that I developed that was really helpful in helping people not only shift mindset, but shift behavior, shift habits, do different things like that. And it was probably the secret of the corporate success that I'd had, because I was able to manage people well and, get through conflicts and do all these different things. And so as soon as I saw how special that was and how meaningful that was, I was really calling to help other people in a big way. And so I never looked back. I think it was probably 2006 that I started my business. So it's been, 14 plus years now that I've been solely working on helping people evolve. And I've developed this thing called identity shifting, which is, really what I think is the most meaningful way to go in and take somebody through the transformation that's required to really personally evolve into a profoundly different version of themselves.
And there are many things that you mentioned that I want to dive deeply in a moment. Before that, I wanted, because you have that fundamental shift, as you call it, I want to ask, apart from that fundamental shift, was there any other key defining moment or turning point in your journey?
There were probably many of them. That is without a doubt the most profound. After that, there were levels of I'm now sober about 16 years, right? Just, I'm not, although I really love and appreciate the path of 12-step programs and all the areas that those exist. I'm not personally somebody who follows that. I don't go to meetings. I sort of did this in another way. I actually used a coach and a mentor and a counselor who's deeply steeped in the steps that was really helpful to me. So it's not that there's no influence of that, but I don't really do meetings myself and that. But that was another big choice of mine, because I was actually very successful in the corporate world. I'd put down very heavy drugs and things. I had my own limits about what I would and wouldn't do. But there was a time when I actually decided, I'm actually going to not do anything. I want to deal with consciousness directly. And that was, another profound shift in my own commitment to what it is to be alive, what it is to make meaning, what it is to relate to, the universe. Right. And I didn't want to alter myself anymore. And I didn't want to use substances to escape painful things. I wanted to go through painful things and evolve from them and use the learnings and all that. And that's a pretty big change as well.
I bet.
Yeah.
Especially with alcohol, which I wasn't really planning to ask you about that. But
Sure.
Since you brought it up, I think what you said about escape, the word escape, is something that some people do not realize. So many people that drink socially or drink, they're not a heavy drinkers, but they drink frequently. It's only if they stop for a period of time. I can speak by my own personal experience when I did a challenge, a 6-month alcohol-free challenge. And I realized very quickly after a month or two that easy way out of a negative emotional situation was not there anymore. So I had to face it, and that gave me some big realizations.
Totally. I'm not sitting here telling anybody to be sober, right? It's if you I think people can use alcohol and different things very successfully, right? There's a great place for that for some people. I think that addiction in general can be expanded out into when our mind gets captured by some hyper stimulus that puts us not only chemically, but emotionally and otherwise out of balance. And so I think we're seeing that to some degree with our digital experience these days, right? We get this addiction to sort of scrolling on Instagram or to feeling differently by the next, little hit that we get from
Yeah.
the next picture, the next picture, the next picture. And we're noticing that our time, where if we really were in our highest version of self, we might be creating or doing something that was, good for us. We end up just escaping and trying to feel differently, whether we're even fully conscious of it or not. But you sort of wake up and go, wow, it's 3 hours later and I've just been rolling through TikTok or whatever, right? It becomes a thing where we're getting captured by something. And I think that concept of hyperstimulus is really important. I heard it from a guy named Daniel Schmachtenberger, who is a phenomenal thinker. He points out that all addiction is really around where we pull out what in its natural state might be really sustaining and good, but we pull it out into its most potent form, and it becomes a hyperstimulus. So if you think about natural fruits and things that have sugars that are very good in their balance in nature, we pull out the sugar and we put it into a pile and we just eat the sugar, and it overstimulates the body, right? We do that with fats as well. We do that with cocaine. If you were to just chew on a cocaine leaf, it may not be the worst thing in the world for you. It might give you focus and whatever, but if you pull it out and you do lines of cocaine, it's a hyperstimulus, and it oversaturates dopamine, and it gets the brain into a really hypercritical state. And again, to whatever degree, this can begin to happen with the technology that we're doing and all the other things. So I think we're watching a culture and a world that's becoming more addicted without noticing it in a lot of directions where it's not okay to just actually be, right? It's actually, and so we need these stimuluses, like you were saying, alcohol, to feel quote unquote normal or to feel okay with what is. And that is where it's beginning to get out of balance. And so back to my choice with it, it was obvious to me that I was using it to feel differently and to manage certain things that were uncomfortable. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be okay without anything. I wanted to see if I could, do that. And it's been a deeply meaningful, very rewarding choice in my life.
Absolutely. I know. Let's go back to that fundamental shift. You described it as a self-transcending experience that changed everything in your life, a turning point. Was that instant, or did it take a period of time?
I think change, I don't want to say always, but I think change actually happens instantaneously, but the work up to it takes time, right? The shift is a real switch very often. But mastery is often not like that. Mastery is getting better at something over time. But I often say that if you bring somebody to me who's depressed, I can actually change their state and make them happy in an instant. But I can't make them concert pianist. I can't make them billionaire, right? Those things take mastery and development over time, right? So I call it wake up and there's grow up, right? So you can wake up in this moment, but then to apply that over time, you really need to grow up and you need to apply it in all its ways. And, that's a game of time. But the wake up is and can be instant. As far as that self-transcendence, can I give that a model? I want to actually talk about that. So the name of your podcast is Personal Development Mastery, right? If we talk about what it is to personally develop, I think that the most profound version of that, what I've chosen to call that, is identity shifting, right? It's literally becoming a profoundly different version of yourself in some way. And I think that there are levels of doing that. And the first one is a sense of self-mastery, right? And the next level would be some sense of self-actualization. And then the next level of that, maybe the highest level of that, would be some sense of a self-transcendence. And so rather than defining each of those with exact terms, because they're big terms and all that, it's maybe more useful to sort of figure out what each of those means and what we're pointing to, so that we can just at least understand them. So if we talk about self-mastery, I would say that that's some degree of self-control and some degree of being able to overcome your unconscious habits, maybe some of your unconscious biases, maybe some of your impulses that are more instant gratification based instead of delayed gratification based, right? I think that distinction is really important, because there's a version of you that you want to be that's going to require that you delay gratification and don't always do the immediate interesting thing, right? The immediate interesting thing is that sugar, or is that drink of alcohol, or that I'm going to watch TV right now, or I'm just going to eat food on the couch and be comfortable right now. I love comfort right now. Like, let's not, that's a great thing. But when it's at the cost of who you could become and what you're really trying to move toward, self mastery is some version of having more control over yourself so that you can start to apply yourself in the areas that matter. If we get into self actualization, what I mean by that, or what I'm trying to point that toward, is that then you're using some form of that self mastery to actualize some potential in the things that matter most to you, right? So let's say you want to be a business owner. Well, self actualizing in that is actually becoming a business owner that's talented at that, right? So that even if your business was taken away, you didn't just get lucky, you could go build another business. Like, you actually have the skills and the ability and the self mastery to actualize in that potential. If you're trying to be an athlete, it's not just the desire of being an athlete, but you've actualized in something, you've actually become something in that. And then I think the thing that is even beyond a lot of that is a quality of self transcendence. And so if what I mean by self transcendence and what that might be pointing toward is that you're not only you're not only a sense of self, right? If the only focus that we have is always about me, that's actually a little narcissistic, right? That's spiritually, there's an idea of like putting down the self and actually just being in consciousness without maybe even an ego in that moment, right? And so there are parts of self that if we can't objectify them and get away from them, they're actually really hard to change if we're in them, right? So getting some sense of self transcendence, and to make that even clearer, some of the parts that matter the most is the we space, right? So like you and I being here, if I'm really going to listen to you, I have to put down myself to some degree to try to model what you mean, right? So if I'm doing that literally just in that moment of, if I'm genuinely trying to listen to you, I've put down myself, I've transcended myself in some sense. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually trying to model what you are. So as we grow the we space, how we govern, how we build companies, how we run families, how we parent, there's this idea of the capability of being able to transcend self or get beyond egoic me, right? In some meaningful way. So if we go back to what happened to me, I actually almost did it in the wrong direction. I had this big transcendent experience, but I didn't really have a great sense of self mastery yet. And I certainly hadn't actualized in any directions yet, right? So as I had this transcendent kind of thing, it was like I had this almost big spiritual awakening or some real seeing that was deeply meaningful to me. But if I go back to it, it was messy for me. Like, it was hard work to then figure it out from there. So as
Mm-hmm.
I coach on this, the first steps of this are dealing in the space of self mastery on some level. Like, do you have the capability from where you are to overcome your own limits in some significant way? Can you begin to make the moves that are the better choices and manage your state of self really towards some meaningful self actualization for yourself, while building the capability to put down yourself when that's appropriate and actually begin those tools of self transcendence as well? And when you put those three things together, you really can become this profoundly different version of yourself that's optimized in a lot of ways that are deeply meaningful.
Awesome. And let me ask you, since you mentioned the term of spiritual, what does that term mean to you, spirituality?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that I want to make tangible for people, because I think there's a lot of woo around this. Beliefs might be
Mhm.
a really interesting place to get into, because there's a tangible way to talk about beliefs. I'm not talking about believing in something. I'm not talking about anything like that. To me, um, the spiritual is almost the ground level of just being, right? It's if you can actually take on a position that just being alive is pretty
Mhm.
darn amazing, right? You've actually accomplished quite a bit, right? That this is the difference between a self that is captured in time, in I'm not there yet, I'm not enough, this isn't enough, I have to get to somewhere else, right? A quality of bringing spirituality into the moment is a deep appreciation, which may look in tangible terms more like being grateful or
Mhm.
being present or being able to put down thought. Like, there's a deep difference between thinking and experiencing. Actually, different parts of the brain light up. And so many of us are just caught in thought all the time. We actually don't know how to turn off thought. We don't know what is thought, what isn't thought. We think a lot of our thoughts are real things. So when we worry about something, it feels very real and we get very activated by it, but it's only a thought. And so things like meditation and things like that that can give you a sense of what the difference is between what a thought is, what that impulse is, which is very instant gratification, right? If a thought wants to be chased and followed, it's like, this is important, pay attention. But a spiritual move there is noticing, oh, that's a thought, having the ground of knowing I'm something that's thinking right now. And there's also experience of my breath, of the ground. And so to make that a little bit more tangible, two people are walking down a hall. One is deeply lost in thought and worried about their taxes or what somebody thinks of them or what's going on and all that. That is not very spiritual. That is much more human, right? Somebody else is very present and every step on the ground is beautiful. Every breath is just embodied and really pleasant and amazing. That is an expression of being spiritual. You're connected to isness and being much more profoundly.
I like very much the way you described it. It's very.
And by the way, those are skills, right? Those are not things to believe in or hope for or wish about. Because if you're doing that, that's just more thinking. That's just more modeling of maybe one day I'll get there, right? Maybe one of the biggest problems with Buddhism is if somebody studies something like that, whether it's Taoism or Buddhism or whatever, that there's some enlightened place to get to that's away from here. That's exactly the opposite expression of actually being enlightened, which is just being here, right? Being right where you are. And by the way, that's not always pleasant, right? If you're anxious, the spiritual move is literally just to be anxious, right? There's truly an energy in your chest. Your breathing is heavy, right? But not changing it and being with it, being conscious of what is the spiritual move in that moment, right? If we can just use the term spiritual to try to describe that. I think that's what a deep sense of spirituality can look like.
That's fantastic. You said something about the thoughts and recognizing that it's only a thought and not to identify with the thought, which is something that many people are completely unaware of, that the thoughts just... I've been doing recently a Sam Harris course on meditation, and he talks about things appearing in consciousness. So thoughts, feelings, anything like appearances in consciousness, which is an incredible way to describe all those things. Not necessarily simple to grasp. It needs practice. You said that it is a skill that we need to work on it.
Well, can I give a shortcut about that I think is really valuable? I like to think about attention as a place. Okay. Your attention can be lots of places. So anybody listening right now, let me take your attention to what a skyscraper is, right? So right now, if you follow me, you'll be imagining a skyscraper, right? There's a big building and it's not 50 stories, but it's 100 stories. So now we've just got more specific about what you're imagining, but that's a thought. That's an imagination. Now I want you to imagine when you were 10 years old, whatever the first thought of you being 10 years old is that pops in, that's another place that your attention just moved to. It's not with the building anymore. It's now when you were 10 years old. Maybe you're riding a bike or swimming with your family or, in some holiday situation, whatever. Now we could take your imagination over to a place in the future. We could imagine, what's your life going to be like 3 years from now, right? That's another place that your attention can go. And so it seems like my attention can go to an infinite amount of places, right? Which it certainly can, because your imagination, we could keep imagining countless things, right? Literally infinite things. But there's a deep distinction between the difference between those things and literally what your left foot feels like right now. Like if you go into moving your attention, we've moved the place, it's a different place. What does your left foot feel like right now? What does your right foot feel like right now? What does your breath at your nostrils feel like right now, right? And so we're moving your attention around. Now there's two important dimensions to understand. One of those was in thought and imagination, the future, the past, a building, anything that I would make up that's real or imagined is all thought, right? Most people are lost there and they don't ever actually get into the other side of it, which is experience, right? The actual experience of what your left foot feels like, I would say, is not a thought. You could think about it, right? We could make it a thought, but if you're actually just experiencing your left foot, it's a different thing. It's a different embodied experience. And so realizing when you're thinking and when you're in experience gives you this access to, again, what I might call very spiritual or very um, present or mindful, is this ability to quiet thought and come into experience, which is quite literally what most practices of meditation are trying to teach. But the important distinction there is learning what is thought and what is experience. And if you can ground and experience more, your thoughts become much more manageable. You can literally drop them just by moving attention, just by saying, my attention is in a place, I'm captured in a worry, or I'm captured in a fantasy, or I'm captured in a desire. I can drop that and come back into literally this moment. And what you'll find with practice, people who aren't practiced in this moment is pretty uncomfortable because they're anxious, they're overwhelmed, they're whatever, right? So coming into that experience in beginning meditators, let's say, can be pretty uncomfortable. You don't want to stay there because it's like, but here stinks. I don't want to be here. I have no sense that here is a nice place. But as you learn that here is actually a beautiful place, that all beauty actually happens here, that all joy actually happens here, now you learn to ground into that. And the more mundane, the more regular things become the most beautiful things. And you notice that in the noise of thinking, it requires that hyper stimulus to feel anything. It requires a drink of alcohol to get my body to feel warm and feel tingly. And so I choose hyper stimulus. I choose sugar. I choose drugs. I choose alcohol. I choose TV to feel better. But if you actually get good at just feeling what is, you actually fall into a place where what is just normal everyday life can become more and more and more beautiful. You don't actually want hyperstimulus anymore because you see that as loud and kind of big and actually puts you out of balance. And you start to live a simpler, happier, more manageable life.
Let me ask you a couple of quick questions about that. It's you've taken where the conversation has gone a completely different way, but it's fascinating. One is you said that attention is a place, so it goes here and there. So where does it come from? That's my first one. And the second is you said the difference between attention and experience. So our emotions.
No. So attention can be on thoughts or experience.
Okay, right.
Okay. Or maybe thoughts or sensation. Let's say that, right? Because you're also experiencing your thoughts. I mean, again, we're using words. So words are just pointers. We'll do our best navigating this. Where does attention come from? That might be the hard question of consciousness. Like, why are we awake? Why are we alive? Right. So let's not get lost in that, because that might be a meaningful conversation. But let's just say you have attention, right? If you're listening to this and you're alive and aware, you have attention, right? Your attention is somewhere. And one of the big things in personal development is, can you manage your attention? Right? If you can't manage your attention, there might be two, there's many versions of that being bad, but two that are obvious are rumination, right? Let's say you've had a breakup and you just can't stop thinking about it. You can't manage your attention to get away from the painful thing. That leads to deep depression. That leads to anxiety, the feeling of overwhelm that just won't go away, right? So that might be rumination, we might say, where you're just stuck on something. Let's say you can't put down being wronged. And so you become, in your sense of self, angry, right? You just can't put down that this person, I mean, that was very much how I lived my life. I was very much victimized. Like, the fact of me being a victim is true, but if I couldn't put down and literally forgive and get past victimization, then I'm the one carrying victimhood, right? I'm the one who can't put that down. And so that shows up, because if I'm a victim, everywhere I go, I have to find the way to be a victim in that situation, right? The other way that our attention can be messy, which we're seeing a lot with technology today and just all the choices that we have, is I can't focus my attention. It's scattered everywhere. I'm on Amazon.com, and then I'm on Twitter, and then I'm in my email, and then I'm trying to do this, and I can't actually focus down. I can't garner my attention to put it on anything that matters, right? So I've already talked about learning how to put it on sensation and how that can become a really beautiful experience in a spiritual sense. But let's talk about being productive. Like, if you want to write a book, you're going to have to garner your attention. How many people do you know that talk about writing a book and 3 years later, they're still talking about writing the book? They've never written the book. How many people want to start podcasts, but they can't garner their attention to actually go all the way through. There's lots of reasons for that. It might be self-sabotage, it might be whatever, but a lot of that is not garnering the ability to manage their attention in a way that doesn't have them scattered. So managing your attention and realizing those two domains of I'm thinking versus I'm experiencing, and can I focus my attention anywhere that matters for a meaningful amount of time so that I can accomplish certain things, like just do the dishes and stay with the dishes until they're done, right? Instead of I started the dishes, but now I'm folding clothes and now I'm doing this and now I'm doing that. And now I'm listening to a podcast and all of a sudden it's 3 p.m. and where did the day go? And nothing got finished, right? So that quality of self-mastery to garner your attention in a certain place and leave it there is incredibly powerful, right? As one of the foundational skills that people seem to need.
I was smiling because I can relate to that. I think we all have, especially in this modern era of constant distraction seekers from technology, it needs quite a lot of determination, switching off your phone when you're doing something just to focus on that. Otherwise, it's so easy for the attention to go to another place and another place.
And not to keep kind of switching the goalposts here on what we're talking about, but your point of like the will that's involved in that, willpower is necessary for what we don't have mastery of, right? So there's actually some switches that can change that give you mastery in this space. So it becomes habitual and obvious how to put your attention somewhere and leave it in a more meaningful way, right? So we want to do this not through willpower, although willpower is a great thing, right? I'm not against willpower, but if that's your only tool, you're going to find that that's a very depleted, difficult, long task of changing. What actually is a faster way of changing is going into some of the subconscious things that are happening, gain some different skills of consciousness at a fundamental level that then are applicable in all these different directions without willpower.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me talk, then I'll go back and I will leave this is as fascinating as this conversation is.
Sure.
I will change to something that is something you say about identities. And you say that there is a core problem that humanity has, which is the limit of our current identity, the identities that we hold. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on where you pull that from, and oftentimes, if you pull a certain tidbit, it's maybe not always appropriate, right? Yeah. So let's say that if your sense of self is not sound, it's going to be a deep limiter. It is the thing that needs to shift before other things are going to shift for you. Okay, so if you are, let's say you have a lot of limiting beliefs that you can't see about yourself, but they're in your sense of self. So things like, I'm not enough, I'll never succeed, I'm actually not a beautiful person, I'm not popular, I'm not good with people, right? These are what I would call limiting beliefs that we take on, and they feel true to us. So I would say that they make up a sense of self that is now going in the world. And so if you're trying to become good at sales, but you think that, I'm not deserving of money, right? You're going to limit yourself without even knowing it, right? So you end up with these invisible to you limits in your sense of self that is the core limiting factor. So I would say that much coaching out there, maybe most coaching, is incomplete in the fact that it's often very skills based, right? So you might go to a nutrition coach to learn a diet technique and a plan, which is great, and maybe it's exactly right. But if you put that on top of a self that is not capable of change or growth, is maybe set to, I'm not good at this, or I'm never going to be healthy, or I'm not athletic, or whatever those sense of self is. If you're just putting that skill on top of something that's going to self-sabotage its way out, you're going to need other coaching, or you're going to need to follow up, or you're going to need to do whatever. In the world, even of therapy is often very emotionally based, which is deeply important, but it's not very skills based, right? It doesn't give you the skills out here. So what's at the center of all of your desires and also all of your limits and problems is you, right? The common denominator underneath is you. So if you're not shifting yourself to get over your own biases and limits and things like that, any skills that you add on top are on this sort of weak foundation of you to begin with. So that's, I guess, what I mean by core problem in this, in a sense of identity that's not doesn't have mastery or actualization, or doesn't have a quality of being able to transcend the ego and self in any way.
Would you say that apart from a collection of beliefs or a bunch of beliefs, is there anything else to identity apart from the beliefs we hold?
Yeah, I mean, identity again is something that we could maybe say is very vast in all the ways that we could talk about what it is. I think that if I were to simplify it down for this conversation,
Mm-hmm.
um, you have in the realm of thinking. Let's think about it this way: if you're going to change who you are in a profound way, you're going to need to think different thoughts for sure, right? If you just keep thinking your same pattern of thinking and you don't gain any mastery in being able to change your attention and how you think, that's going to be a problem. You need to deeply change how you feel about things. You're going to need to grow in some emotional mastery sense, because honestly, if let's say you're depressed, even if I were to add millions of dollars to your bank account and make you really successful, if you still feel depressed, what's it really worth? It's not the point. The reason we want the money is we want to feel differently. We want to feel secure and proud and happy and all those things.
Yeah.
And then we also want some mastery over doing, right? We want to do meaningful things. We want to be able to apply ourselves to the tasks at hand that matter to us and succeed through them. So thinking, feeling, and doing, if all of those can change, right, then we're really a different person, right? Then we've really grown and changed. And we do this all the time. You don't think the same things that you thought when you were 5, right? Some people do get stuck, and maybe they think very much similarly to how they thought when they were 20. But if you're growing and changing, you'll notice that you're probably changing how you think. You're learning, you're seeing different things, you're taking on new stuff. But in the realm of thinking, there's not only these conscious tools that we've talked about, tools of being able to focus your attention and all that stuff, maybe changing the meaning of something, right? If I see somebody who looks at me funny and I notice that I think it means that they don't like me, consciously maybe I can change the meaning of that, right? I can change what that means, and that's very meaningful, and that's a conscious
Mm-hmm.
tool, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a set of conscious tools how we can change our conscious thinking that are profoundly helpful. But we've also talked about these unconscious patterns, right? This is changing thought, but doing in a way that's addressing the parts of ourself that we can't see. And if we talk about the unconscious, right, you're making your heartbeat right now, but you're not consciously aware of how. Like if I said, "Hey, stop your heartbeat right now," you couldn't if you wanted to, right? So there are processes that are going on outside of our conscious awareness, and many of these are things that we take on about ourselves. These limits that, when we take them on, they're usually protective and really helpful when we take them on, but they
Mm-hmm.
end up limiting us later, right? We end up overcorrecting because somebody embarrassed us, or we had an abusive parent, or a friend was mean to us in middle school, or whatever happened along the way. We take on things again like, I'm not enough, or I don't deserve money, or even things like rich people are jerks, right? A lot of people think rich people are jerks, but they really want money. How are they going to resolve that, right? Your subconscious mind isn't going to let you become something that you detest. So you have to change your unconscious patterns about money and
Mm-hmm.
about, I've worked with very overweight people. And if you try to add willpower to a diet and exercise, that's going to be very difficult. And almost everybody fails at that. But if you go in and change them at an identity level into, I am an athlete, right? Well, if they really take that on sincerely in their unconscious, an athlete works out, an athlete feeds themselves well, an athlete does things. And even if they're horribly overweight presently, them taking on, I am an athlete, doesn't require willpower. The right behaviors and the right things start to happen because they've shifted that unconscious mind. So in the thinking realm, you have this unconscious world that needs to be addressed. You've got conscious tools that need to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And then out in the emotional space, there's some meaningful shifts to gain emotional mastery. And then in the doing space, there's some things with purpose and focus and different things like that that help you in the doing space. So if I were to break down identity, it's got all those parts, right?
That's great. I like very much your differentiation between the conscious tools we can use for a limiting belief or a behavior and the unconscious, dealing with the unconscious patterns, which is where they actually originate from.
Yeah.
Uh,
Can I say more about that real quick?
Please
Sorry to
do.
interrupt you. Yeah. So a way to illustrate that is your conscious mind gaining mastery of your own attention. You really can get past suffering to a great degree with that. And so let me define suffering really quickly, and then I'll try and backtrack to this really fast.
Okay.
If I were to simplify suffering down to maybe the most elegant way to say it that I know of is suffering is resisting what is. Okay. So any kind of suffering, physical, emotional, mental suffering, is something is occurring and my sense of being doesn't like it. And so I deeply resist it, right? So think of a child who doesn't get their way. I can't watch my show, right? The reality is they're not going to be able to watch their show, but they can't accept it. And so there's deep suffering, right? If I get punched in the arm, there's a sensation and what I might call pain. I'm not saying we need to get rid of pain. Pain's deeply important. But my suffering about the pain, I have options with that. I can go in and be curious about what the tingling in my arm feels like. If I were a trained Marine, it might be no big deal. But if I were a really afraid person, a punch might be devastating to me. Like it could traumatize me for my life, right? So there's a whole scale of suffering that can happen in there. So let's say we gain the conscious tools to manage suffering so that I'm truly at peace in a great way, right? Well, I'll switch gears and talk about a quality of humans that's maybe unique, right? We're the only people that you could literally sit in a white room with no stimulus at all. And through our own mind, through that imagination that I talked about before, we could literally put ourselves into a panic, right? With no stimulus at all, no real problems happening at all. I could just get depressed by my meaning making that I'm doing, right? I could make meaning that makes me anxious or makes me depressed or makes me happy, right? I have a lot of ability to affect what I'm doing just in my own meaning making, even if nothing is happening. Okay. So let's say that I'm in that white room and I'm a master at this. It's fantastic. Thoughts are still going to pop up, even with no stimulus. Stimulus affects you, right? If you're in a bad situation and you've got an abusive person in your life, that will affect your thinking. That will affect your suffering to whatever degree. And so there are doing things in the world to get away from those. But let's say we've even mastered that. Now I'm in the white room. Nothing's happening to me. Thoughts are still popping up. Where are they coming from, right? They're coming from the unconscious mind. Okay. So even if I've got total mastery of my conscious mind, theoretically, if I have bad patterns that are popping up, I'm not enough, you're never going to be good, nobody likes you, whatever. If those are the thoughts that are coming up, I can maybe even deal with them once they're conscious and go, no, I can change the meaning of that. I can change the meaning of that. But how exhausting would that be if you have this horrible set of patterns, right? And so that's why both of these really matter, right? You've got to gain these conscious tools, but if you don't address those patterns that are coming up, it's very difficult. And so a lot of people talk about the subconscious and it's like, well, you can't see the unconscious. What could you possibly do about it? Well, you can't see the unconscious yourself because it's truly outside of consciousness to you, but you can see the effects of it. You can see that you continually procrastinate. You can see that, in a shadow work kind of way, you can see that, well, I keep seeing that everybody's angry at me, but people are telling me that they're not angry. Like that might be coming from me, right? There are hints of what's happening there that you can find to go back and actually repattern many of those things and ultimately give you an unconscious that's serving up wonderful, useful things, right? If the thoughts that are on autopilot are useful and helpful, that's amazing, right? Like how great would that be? And then you have the conscious tools to deal with all the challenges that come up out here or otherwise. Now you're optimized. Now you're truly a different version of yourself. Now you're, deeply realized and actualized, etc.
So when you talk about the modifying the unconscious patterns, do you mean by using tools like hypnosis, NLP, RTT, this kind of things?
Sure. Those are fantastic tools. There's things like shadow work. I've created things called story casting. There is, there's timeline therapy. There are tons of tools to start playing with. How do I repattern what I truly believe about the world, right? So I mentioned belief before, and I'd like to put that into a term so we could point at what I mean by that, at least, right? I really like the definition of belief as an assuredness of meaning. Okay. So I think of what I'm believing in any moment as being real or true is the assuredness of the meaning of the moment. Okay. And so I think we're noticing in our world today, in the complexity of our world today, that truth and trust are being challenged in every direction, right? We don't really trust our institutions. We don't really trust our leadership. We don't trust corporations. We're breaking down, how do I make meaning of what's going on, right? So we have to get this meaning making machine that we've got going on up here, and we have to get more artful at that. Well, beliefs about myself are meaning that I take on, and I'm assured that it's right? So if I've taken on a belief that I'm not enough, now I have that belief. And so to me, it seems true, right? So the act of changing my beliefs is actually down to changing my truth. I have to have the quality of being able to challenge truth. Now, it's not challenging all truth, right? It's not like I'm going to disagree with gravity or things that are useful, but I want to look for these things that are showing themselves to be deep limits in me. Yeah. And I need the ability to challenge the truth of that, right? So imagine a client comes into a coach and they just won't put down the truth of, I'm a loser, right? I'm a loser, Rob. No, you don't get it. I lost yesterday. I'm going to lose tomorrow. I always lose. That person isn't going to be able to change at all, right? Step number one is getting them to go, could you put down that maybe you could not be a loser tomorrow? Like, is there, like, we have to get some wiggle room with some of these truths, right? So if money is bad or rich people are evil or whatever those things are, to change that belief, we have to start playing with the truth of them in a way that's meaningful. And once you've shifted them over and given people a new truth about themselves and about the world, now you have the ability to really transform what that unconscious is serving up in a meaningful way.
Thank you for listening to the first part of the interview with Rob Scott. Tune in to the next episode, number 38, where Rob talks about self-sabotage, how the comfort zone is not really comfortable, instant gratification, thinking versus experiencing, and many more fascinating subjects. Thank you very much for listening. Please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review Personal Development Mastery on Apple Podcasts. If you want to know more about me and how I can help you, join my Facebook group Personal Development Mastery. The link is in the show notes, or you can simply type bit.ly/PDM group. And until next time, stand out, don't fit in.